Hello students. In the last lecture, we discussed about the background of the Marxist theory of international relations and several of its key features such as a focus on global capitalist system, analysis of the social world in its totality, materialistic interpretation of history and a focus on class conflict. In this lecture, we will compare and contrast Marxist theory of international relations with political realism and look at some of its criticisms leveled against Marxism. Our discussion will proceed on the basis of the following outline. First, we will compare Marxism with realism, then we will look at the criticisms against Marxism in general, and then we will end our discussion with some concluding remarks. Now let us compare the classical Marxism with realism, because that will again give us a very good kind of picture for understanding international politics. Lenin, the communist leader of the Russian Revolution of 1917, analyzed this process. He argued that the process of capitalist expansion must always be unequal or uneven between countries, industries and arms. So, Lenin in fact made the famous statement that capitalism is the highest stage of imperialism. So, according to Lenin, because of the inherent tendency of the capitalists to go for territorial expansion, because they will get market, they will get cheap labor, they will get cheap raw material. So, that leads to the uneven development in different parts of the world. That was his main reason how he understood Marxism. As such disparities and conflicts will always develop under the capitalist conditions, argued Lenin. This is what he called the law of uneven development. So, more and more capitalist expansion, more through the state, through wars, through control, through multinational companies, that will lead to a kind of situation that will cause uneven economic development in many parts of the world. The notion of uneven development points to the need for historical analysis of capitalist expansion. A Marxist analysis must therefore also be clear about history, because history must always be analyzed in the specific historical context. So, if you want to understand the kind of competition between France, between Germany, between Netherlands, between Spain, between United Kingdom during the 19th century and early parts of 20th century, you will understand how these countries, they were fighting against each other, they were trying to occupy more and more areas under their physical control, because behind that competition there were the capitalists who were controlling those states, and they were causing this kind of war, this kind of problem in the world. So, there is a need to understand the historical context in which this kind of situation happened. But if we compare Marxist theory with the realist theory of international relations, that will again give us a good picture and understanding the differences between these two theories, and also understanding Marxism in a much better way. The difference between Marxist and the realist analysis therefore needs better analysis. Both those theories agree on the perennial competition and conflict between the states, but realists explain this by pointing to the existence of independent states in the condition of anarchy. So, the realists basically focus on anarchy, or what Walter said, international structure that is characterized by anarchy. So, this kind of anarchical condition is the major reason why states compete against each other, why there is conflict and war against each other. So, that was the reason for the realist. But the Marxists reject that kind of view as abstract and unhistorical. It is abstract because there is no analysis of the social forces that actually sustain conflict between the states. These social forces are the ruling classes of the capitalists and or their allies, and they ultimately control and determine what their states do. So, if you want to know the nature of international politics, if you want to know the kind of competition, the kind of war these countries are fighting against each other or competing against each other, so you have to understand that through the analysis of the role of bourgeois in those states, because those bourgeois use the state for their own interest, or they control the state for their expansion of capitalism, forces them to do what they do through the state. When states are rivals and sometimes comes into conflict, it is because they pursue economic and political interest for international dominance and control sought after by the ruling class. So, the role of ruling class is very important according to the Marxist, because they are prompted by the capitalist, and some of the capitalists, they also enjoy power because of their wealth, because of their resources. They not only control the state, sometimes they also become the rulers. So, you can't think of fighting an election if you don't have the money. So, that is the problem, and that is how the Marxists want to emphasize that if you want to understand the nature of international relations, you have to understand the role of the ruling class, particularly the role of the capitalist community or capitalism in the operation of international politics. The realist view is also unhistorical according to the Marxist, as conflict between states varies substantially across history. So, if you look at the realists, they think that conflict is a perennial problem, and if you want to understand conflict from the realist perspective, you have to look at the power distribution, you have to look at the selfish nature of the state, and you have to also understand international politics through conflict and clash of interest. But the Marxists, they consider that this is something very unhistorical, because there is no historical evidence. Consequently, competition and conflict of earlier historical phases require a different kind of explanation. So, if you want to understand the operation of different states in different periods of history, so you cannot just go through the power distribution factor or balance of power factor or the anarchical nature of international relations. Rather, you have to look at the working of or the functioning of the state system in several historical periods by going at different kind of historical explanation that would help you to understand the true nature of the states, the capitalist nature of the states, or those who own the means of production and distribution. Realists argue that the Marxist view of the state is reductionist, because it reduces the state to a simple tool in the hands of the ruling class with no will of its own. So, that was the criticism by the realist against the Marxist, that Marxist theory is highly deterministic, it is reductionist, because it does not look at the state as an autonomous actor. It is basically a tool in the hands of the ruling class, and it has no identity of its own. States are strong actors in their own right. They basically are powerful institutions, they control the means of violence, and also they have substantial economic resources. So, states are not just the tools in the hand of the capitalist class, rather they are autonomous actors, and they hold enormous amount of coercive power like army, like police. They have also different kinds of institutions, and they have also substantial economic resources, which you have to understand independently of capitalism. It is simply wrong to view the state as a mere instrument of others. More recent Marxist analysis has considered to this point. So, the recent Marxist analysis differs from the classical Marxist analysis, and they think that the state is not always controlled by the capitalist, rather it is relatively autonomous, and that we will discuss when we discuss about neo-Marxism. The state has some autonomy from the ruling classes, but it is a relative autonomy. The basic function of the capitalist state remains the same, that is safeguarding of the capitalist system, and more Marxists accept that although the state is not fully captured or fully used by the capitalists, it enjoys some autonomy, some relative autonomy. They all agree with this fact that this is a relative autonomy, but the basic function of the capitalist system is same, it remains the same, and that is the safeguarding of the capitalist system. After comparing the realist theory with the Marxist theory, let us focus on some major criticisms leveled against the classical Marxist theory of international relations. There are so many criticisms, and first, class structure today is more complex than the capitalist workers or the bourgeois proletariat distinction. In fact, in most Western countries as well as increasingly in the developing ones, there is a strong middle class that possesses stocks and shares invested in multinational corporations run by what Marxists call as the capitalist class. So, when the Marxists are talking of the class analysis, they are not talking of the role of the middle class. So, nowadays in every country you will find more and more middle class people, they are coming out of poverty, they are coming out of the kind of life as was there for the working class. they have become rich, there are more millionaires, there are more billionaires. In fact, the Indian middle class is much more than the total population of the United States. So, the Marxists have never thought about this aspect, particularly of the emergence of and the role of middle class in any state. Second, the capitalist structure today can be said to be less exploitative. There are two reasons for that. The first is the workers are paid better wages, so that a demand can also be generated for surplus production. So, nowadays you will find the wage structure is increasing, the government control over the capitalist system is also increasing, and rather they are getting better wages than the earlier period. In addition, the state has come to play a more benign role in regulating capitalism. In many countries like the Scandinavian countries, like in many other countries, you will find that the state has become important. The poor people are given rations, there is a minimum support price. The state is also taking a lot of welfare measures for the benefit of the poor people, for the benefit of the working class. It is not that the state is not autonomous, it is always controlled by the capitalists. Rather, the state sometimes behave in a very different way, may not be liked by the capitalist, because sometimes it imposes tax, so many other taxes on the capitalist to bring incomes for reducing the kind of economic gap between the rich and the poor. So, there are so many reasons. Third, Marx argued that whoever controlled the means of production also controlled the economic infrastructure. However, many of our institutions today have at least relative autonomy from the bourgeois control. In fact, great sections of the press are critical of the economic elite, and many popular actors and music artists are extremely critical of the capitalist system. It is not that everybody is worshipping capitalist, there are so many sections of the society, those who are highly critical of the capitalist, highly critical of the economic disparity between the capitalist and the working class. Or in fact, these terms have now become outdated, because nowadays particularly nobody is basically focusing on manufacturing alone. There are so many other areas like information technology and those big IT companies, big tech companies. So, in this context, it is very difficult to say about capitalist and the working class the way Marx understood that before 100 years or maybe 150 years. Fourth, the Marxist hypothesis of the superstructure that is determined by the economic infrastructure and controlled by the capitalists to create false consciousness is also questionable. There are many postmodernists who argue that the popular culture exists independent of the capitalist control and used by the people. So, it is not necessary that the capitalists are controlling everything. The popular culture maintained and used by the ordinary people, that is not something controlled by the capitalist. So, the point is, it is not necessary that we should say or we should argue that the economic infrastructure is always controlled by the capitalist. We can understand a separate kind of culture, a different kind of culture separate from the capitalist control. So, that is the argument by some of the critics. Fifth, in modern companies there is less alienation as well. It is an undeniable fact that workers have a lot more to say through their worker unions. What is more, advanced management techniques provide workers with many opportunities to express themselves and their problems, so that those problems cannot be escalated to a point of conflict. So, now you have worker unions, there are strict rules and regulations. If you violate them, there will be punishment. So, the point is, nowadays you have worker unions, you are better organized than the period when Marx was saying about this. So, this is again a point on the basis of which several critics criticize Marxism. Sixth, the classic theory is too much deterministic. Marx argued that economic laws shape not only the society but also the direction of history itself. However, in the light of our historical experiences, this may not necessarily be true. So, many critics think that the kind of Marxist analysis is basically deterministic, because whatever is said, that is not exactly happening. So, in fact, if we take some examples, that will clearly explain this point. Indeed, many different factors shape human society. For instance, most American and British leaders have pushed liberalism. Scandinavian countries have followed social democratic line. China has adopted a form of autocratic capitalism, while Cuba preferred a socialist kind of dictatorship. So these examples reveal that Marxist interpretation of human history is too simplistic and reductionist. So what Marx said, that is not going to happen, and we have historical examples. China is considered as a communist country, but it's not a communist country in the sense Marx understood. China has become more capitalist nowadays, what you can say autocratic and capitalist country, and there are different versions of socialism or communism in Cuba, in North Korea, in other countries. So they may not 100% conform to what Marx said. So in Europe and America, you will find a lot of welfare countries, those who are giving more importance to their people's welfare, their people's happiness. So all these kind of examples prove that what Marx said is not 100% valid. Seventh, the socialist revolution in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe did not lead to greater equality and freedom as Marx would have hoped. In fact, given the failure of the socialist states, many began to argue that it's difficult to see an alternative system to capitalism. So the experience of Soviet Union collapse, what happened in the Eastern Europe, that all proved that it's difficult to find an alternative to the democratic system. For instance, writing after the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history, and he claimed that free market economy and Western type of liberal democracy would be the end point of humanity's socio-cultural and political evolution. So, lots of countries have adopted democratic system of government, including the countries in the Eastern Europe, many countries in West Asia. They are making landmark changes, making landmark reforms. Many countries are going for liberal model. It's questionable that they are all becoming the American kind of liberal democratic countries or European version of democratic country, but they have their own experience, they have their own history, they have their own system which is very similar to the normal democratic countries. The point is everything is not happening the way Marx predicted, the way Marxism predicted. Lastly, it is argued that Marx's grand theory is no longer relevant to today's more complex world affairs. In the sphere of international relations, for example, many transnational issues dominating the current agenda in international politics. There are so many issues like international terrorism, spread of the nuclear weapons, ethnicity or religious driven intrastate conflict, refugee problems, mass violation of human rights, and so on, which cannot be understood in the lenses of classic Marxist theory of international relations. So these are many issues, you can't have a simple class kind of analysis or class analysis. That is again the problem. Hence more attention should be paid to specific problems and local dynamics behind them. So we need a better kind of approach that would explain the importance of local factors, local experiences, because most of the world problems are something very intricate, very complex. You can't have a straightforward answer to all the problems. This is why there is much discussion and disagreement even among contemporary writers who have been influenced by the Marxist writings, as how these ideas and concepts should be interpreted and how they should be put into operation. So a lot of contemporary Marxists, they are interpreting Marxism in a much relevant way, taking into the circumstances of the world today or happenings in the world today. Analysts also differ over which elements of Marxist thought are most relevant, which have been proven to be mistaken, and which should be considered as outdated. So many Marxists, particularly the neo-Marxists, they are working on this, that how to make Marxism more relevant as per the needs of the present day society. Moreover, they differ substantially in terms of their attitudes to the legacy of Marx ideas. The work of the new Marxists, for example, draws more directly on Marx's original ideas that does the work of the critical theorist. So the point is, that is the reason why we have neo-realism, we have neo-Marxism, we have neo-liberalism, because most of the ideas that were formulated, that were given, have lost their relevance, and they need reinterpretation, they need better understanding, keeping in view of the recent developments that is happening in the world. So nobody can predict what is going to happen in the next 5 years or 10 years. So we have to take these factors into consideration and develop a theory that can better explain what is happening at the moment and what will happen in the future. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. we discussed that both realism and Marxism agree on perennial competition and conflict between the sovereign states in international relations. But realists explain it through the existence of independent states in a condition of anarchy, while Marxists analyze the role of social forces that actually sustain conflict between the nation states. Similarly, both liberal theory and the Marxist theory of international relations share a common focus on the potential for change and progress in international relations. They both emphasize the importance of underlying economic structures and interactions in shaping political outcomes, though they conceptualize these influences differently. Liberals focus on how economic interdependence and institutions foster cooperation and peace, while Marxists analyze how global capitalism and class struggle drive conflict and inequality in international relations. Then we discussed how the classical Marxist theory has been subject to many criticisms. These include the complex nature of class structure today, less exploitative capitalist system, relative autonomy of state institutions, existence of popular independent culture, less alienation of workers in the modern industrial setup. In the next lecture, we will discuss about neo-Marxism. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.